I will talk a bit about the precepts, what they are, what the benefits of them are, what to do when you break one, or even when you are about to break one. So Buddhist monks keep 227 precepts, and nuns even keep 311 precepts. When the Buddha started to teach, he did not need to declare any rules, but over time the monastic sangha grew, and sometimes some questionable people started to join them because it gave them the opportunity to go for alms, or they gained a lot of respect because they were walking around in robes, or their family appeared and tried to force them to return or to take care of the children they left behind. So for many different reasons, misbehavior started to develop, and the Buddha needed to add more and more rules because the Sangha requested him to create official directions on what to do. This also meant decisions had to be made on what were to be considered minor offenses and which were considered so bad that they would be cast out of the Sangha. But since we are all lay practitioners, this will talk about the first 5 basic precepts that the more serious lay community, so to speak, aims to keep. And that can already be quite much to keep. In the suttas, they are also sometimes called training rules. So this might relieve the pressure a bit from when you break one. It can be helpful if you decide to keep them, to recite them every morning upon waking up. This can really help set the tone of the day. And you might want to recite them in front of a little Buddha statue or image, but you can also just do it mentally. Make a sincere intention to keep them, because just rote repetition of the sentences without any intention behind it is not that useful. It's really not a ritual, it's an active part of the practice and a huge part of the Noble Eightfold Path. So let's start with an overview and discussing them a little bit by bit. The first one is, I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from killing or harming living beings on purpose. The Buddha described it as not being merciless towards living beings. And it's important to emphasize that it does not count when you accidentally would step on an ant, for example. The Buddha always explicitly talked about the intention of harming. For instance, there is a story of a blind arahant, and he killed insects while walking in his hut. And the other monks did not believe that he could actually be an arahant. So they went to the Buddha to complain, and the Buddha pointed out that he was indeed an arahant. And for an arahant, it is completely impossible to have any harmful intention left. And that blind arahant could not know he was stepping on insects, and he certainly did not mean to do so. Not killing is a part of the Eightfold Path factor of right action, and harmlessness, or in other words, non-cruelty or compassion, is a part of the factor of right intention. I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from taking what is not given, stealing in other words. Instead, be content with what you have. This is also a part of the Eightfold Path factor of right action. I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from sexual misconduct. This entails harming oneself and other beings in the context of sex and relationships. A few examples would be having sex with someone who is protected by relatives, one who is already involved with someone else, so adultery, rape, breaking the law, such as in the case with minors. And it really does not mean one can't have some consensual sex with someone of the same gender, for instance. This is very much about whether one is hurting other people and oneself in the process. And this is also a part of right action. I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from false speech, so not being truthful, divisive speech, so trying to divide people from one another, harsh speech, and the Buddha described this as rough, hurtful, and offensive words bordering on anger, unconducive to collectedness, and idle chatter, which the Buddha defined as speaking at an improper time, what is unbeneficial, contrary to the Dhamma and discipline, using worthless, unreasonable words, and rambling. It does not mean you can't talk about the sports or weather anymore, since this can also be meant to bond or strengthen a bond with other people. But if you listen to a DJ on the radio, for instance, who is just there to play music, they sometimes really ramble about nothing in specific. This is the path factor of right speech. The fifth one is I undertake to keep the precept to abstain from taking drugs and alcohol. Not only do they lead to dullness of the mind, even stimulants, by the way, in the end lead to dullness of mind, but the Buddha also said that it increases the tendency to quarreling, to getting sick, to getting a bad reputation, and it weakens wisdom. It also leads to carelessness, so one might be inclined to break other precepts in the process as well. It does not mean you can't take medication that might have effects on the mind if you need them. And it's the only precept that is not specifically mentioned in the Noble Eightfold Path, but I think its inherent danger is clear enough. The precepts are all about purifying the mind and non-harming, not harming yourself or your reputation, and not harming other beings. The intention to harm means there is cruelty present, or at the very least complete indifference toward other beings, which means there is no compassion at that time. And compassion and loving kindness are part of right intention too. Keeping precepts is something that you can decide to take on instantly, but it can also be more of a development over time. For instance, if one has trouble with alcohol or drugs, it would be very hard, if not almost impossible, to stop using them cold turkey. You might need a plan or some additional assistance to start to keep that precept. Your understanding of the precepts tends to deepen over time as you start to reflect on them. For instance, you start with practicing not to lie, but then you begin to think about those little white lies, as they are often called. Often they are not considered that bad. For instance, when you make an insincere compliment to someone who is asking for your opinion on their hair or their clothes, for instance. But over time, you start to contemplate, is it really that innocent? Or you keep the precept about sexual misconduct, but what about sensual misconduct? Looking for distractions and excitement all the time. Would that count too? You might contemplate what exactly it means to not harm living beings on purpose. Would pulling weeds count? Or cutting a bell pepper from a plant? They are certainly living beings, but on the other hand, we do have to eat something and we can't live on rocks. Does this precept entail respecting the environment, not harming the planet? Should you try your best to recycle or to go by train instead of flying? And how about eating meat? Would you need to become a vegan? And the precept about how intoxicants, so alcohol and drugs, cloud the mind. What do video games do with the mind? Or checking social media obsessively all day long? Or reading multiple newspapers each day? And these are all examples of choices that you will have to decide for yourself. The practice basically comes down to purifying the mind, becoming more and more wholesome in everything you think, say, and do. But how far to take it will be something you can consider. And usually you don't consider these things once, but over time, as your mind inclines more and more towards wholesome behavior. Monastics, by the way, do have strict rules about not damaging plant life. So they are not allowed to cut them, to break them, or to cook them. They are not allowed to pull weeds or even to eat fruit that has seeds in them that could potentially develop into new plants. So when one offers fruit to a nun, for instance, someone needs to cut the fruit for her, and then it's allowable to eat it. But we are lay followers, not monastics. We have 5 precepts, and these can already be quite challenging to start with. It can also happen that these precepts gradually start to extend in some way, so to speak. So you don't harm other beings and instead even reach out to help other beings. You don't take what has not been given and you decide you want to develop generosity more. Or instead of having consensual sex at all, there are some people who take on celibacy, just like nuns and monks do, or lay followers that practice abstention every Uposatha day. So it's not required to be celibate, but some people choose to do so anyway. It just feels better for them. Rather than strictly adhering to right speech, you might also teach yourself to talk less and just listen more carefully to what other people want to share with you. And you keep the precept for not taking intoxicants, but one day you decide, well, maybe I should try to drink less coffee, or maybe I should try to eat more nutritious food. This can all develop from keeping the precepts, but it differs from person to person. There are many benefits when you keep them. In the suttas, the Buddha often explains that good karma gets created and it will lead to a good rebirth. The difference with perhaps Christian religion would be that a good rebirth will entail a very, very long lifespan, but it doesn't mean going to heaven forever, eternally. But it also has direct implications for our practice, since they are part of the Eightfold Path. The Buddha explained that keeping them leads to a more collected mind, which is crucial for your meditation. And over time, you can really observe that adhering to them is very conducive to a calmer mind, which is not only good for when you sit, but also, for instance, for your daily interactions with people, or while at work, or when you are surrounded by screaming toddlers, for instance. Keeping the precepts gradually reduces the amount and intensity of hindrances, while breaking a precept might lead to restlessness or remorse or a lot of additional thinking about it. In fact, it is said that hindrances arise because in the past, whether a few moments ago or lifetimes ago, we broke precepts. There is a clear link between the precepts and the hindrances. If you lie, for instance, this leads to the hindrance of doubt. Harming others gives rise to aversion and hate and ill will, and so on. So breaking precepts can trigger aversion, lust, doubt, sloth and torpor, restlessness, anxiety, and remorse, while keeping them opens the way to wisdom and purification of mind. And along the way, you tend to become someone that people tend to trust more. It's good practice to not only keep the precepts, but also to watch the relationship between what you are doing in daily life and the effect it may have on your meditation. If you check your phone every 5 minutes, if you give in to restlessness along the day, or if you have a very chaotic lifestyle, even though technically you may keep the precepts, it can still lead to much restlessness. Or when you need to deal with certain family members that have very different views from yours, it can cause a lot of tension and worries. Or when you tend to be quite lazy, the mind can become quite dull as a result. So these are just a few examples outside of strictly keeping the precepts. Also keep an eye out for the underlying tendencies of your actions. Why do you say or do certain things? Is it out of boredom, frustration, lust, a strong sense of me, mine, myself? Or do you usually act out of generosity, compassion, and selflessness? You could say that loving kindness and compassion are the foundation to not break these precepts. Because when you wish all beings a happy life and you tend to help them, it will not really make sense to break precepts. It just doesn't occur to you as easily to do that. And so the Noble Eightfold Path factors, which include learning to understand the Dhamma, keeping the precepts, and doing the meditation, all link together in inclining the mind towards the good and the skillful. Every time you have the sincere intention to keep a precept, it strengthens the tendency towards the wholesome, towards the good. And over time, you might see that it really starts to feel good to keep them. You feel more blameless, more pure in a sense. You just like yourself better this way. And so it will gradually start to change your personality. You might tend to become softer, so to speak, and more respectful toward other beings. And you also create some space in your decision making. Instead of reflexively acting in certain situations, you consider for a moment what the best response would be. And your own view towards other people can change as well. Say you had a habit of lying a lot, you would probably also not easily believe what other people tell you. And when you become truthful, your trust in others can grow with it. Or when you tend to dislike people and think they are all bad, over time you understand that while some of them act out of suffering and unwholesome state of mind, other people are kind and want to do good things. The Buddha said that these precepts are streams of merit, streams of the wholesome, nutriments of happiness, so feeding happiness, heavenly, ripening in happiness, conducive to heaven, that lead to what is wished for, desired, and agreeable to one's welfare and happiness. The precepts are not things that tie us down in some sense, but they really lead to a lot of happiness and joy. So, what should you do when you break a precept? While no thunderbolts will be thrown at you, breaking one can at least very much disturb your next sittings. And an unwholesome intention, however subtle, even in thought without actually doing or saying something, creates karma in that moment that will come to fruition at some point with unpleasant results. It doesn't mean it will necessarily have a major impact. It can be a very minor fruition of that piece of karma, but at some point it will happen, whether immediately after the act or after a very long time. This makes that we usually can't know why a hindrance arose. Sometimes we might be able to figure it out. So if you have an argument with someone and during the sitting afterwards, you keep replaying that discussion, it will be very clear that that was the karma that came to fruition. But mostly we have no idea when that karma was, or the fruition of that karma was created, or what was done at that time. So it will not really make sense to keep thinking about why am I so restless, or why does this lust keep coming up, or for instance, why am I doubting or still having doubts in the practice, or whatever it may be. So suppose that for whatever reason you break one. For instance, you were not mindful in that moment. What should you do? There are clear rules for the monastic sangha, but to my knowledge, there are not really official guidelines in the suttas for lay practitioners. However, the suggestions that Bhante Vimalaramsi gives can be quite helpful. He says, first, forgive yourself, because as long as we haven't attained full awakening, we sometimes make mistakes. It just happens. And if you would keep feeling guilty about it, you are reinforcing craving and clinging to it, which is just not a good state of mind to be in. Then he says, recite that particular precept again with the sincere intention to not break it again. And of course, common sense would suggest that you may sometimes need to apologize to people. Also, it would be good to remember that you are not the only one who would break a precept, even if you are an advanced practitioner. It's just not always easy to make the transition from being a worldling, so to speak, to becoming someone who is convinced that this path indeed leads to the end of suffering. And if you have been cursing all day long for many years, and now it only happens occasionally, that's really progress. When you haven't broken a precept yet, but you notice the intention to break it or the urge to break it, use the 6 R's multiple times if necessary. See if you can awaken this craving and clinging. And you might also want to radiate compassion to yourself because you are suffering from this craving, and it can be quite intense. And maybe you can choose a more wholesome alternative. It can also be helpful to take some time to reflect on when this tendency usually arises. Are there certain triggers that are difficult for you? Or does it happen in a specific setting? And can you do something to prevent the things that provoke you? When you know that a birthday with your family tends to stress you out, maybe you can meditate just before going there, or even while you are there already, to maybe arouse some equanimity or empathetic joy for the birthday person. Or when there is boredom or you feel lonely, see if you can take other actions to counter that. Because when you can change the cause, you can change the outcome.